So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's CAPLA talk. My name is Beth Weinstein, for those who don't know me. I'm an associate professor at the School of Architecture, and I serve as chair of the School of Architecture Academic Events Committee, along with faculty members Susanna Dickinson, Oscar Lopez, and Teresa Rosano, as well as the student members of the committee, Nicholas Altamora, Jasmine Guzman, Alfredo Quesada, and Amy Yang. The CAPLA AIA Talk series includes events sponsored by the AIA of Southern Arizona and the two schools comprising CAPLA, or the College of Architecture, Landscape Architecture and Planning at the University of Arizona. The University of Arizona occupies and is built on the original homelands of indigenous peoples who have stewarded this land since time immemorial. And on behalf of the College of Architecture, Planning and Landscape Architecture, I pay my respects to these communities and to their elders past and present. Aligning with the University of Arizona's core values of a diverse and inclusive community, we recognize and acknowledge the people, culture, and history that make up our community. And at an institutional level, we're proactively working to broaden awareness throughout campus to ensure our staff, students, faculty, and guests feel and are represented and valued. While we are still unable to be shoulder to shoulder in lecture halls and exhibition spaces, though starting to be shoulder to shoulder at 2 meters distance in studios, we're seeking ways to gather creative and critical thinkers and makers from nearby as well as places far away to share their thoughts and work with our distributed community of students, faculty, staff, and alumni, and other friends wherever they may be. So I'd like to inform you about 3 upcoming events, which are the last 3 events in our series this fall semester. At noon on November 13th, the School of Landscape Architecture and Planning is hosting a talk by Dr. Missy Stubbs, who's the Sustainability and Innovations Manager for the City of Ann Arbor. On November 20th, at 4:30 in the afternoon, Eddie Jones, FAIA of Jones Studio Inc. in Phoenix, Arizona, will be giving a talk sponsored by the AIA of Southern Arizona. And last, at 4:30 on December 11th, Jack DeBartolo III, FAIA, will be giving also a talk sponsored by the AIA of Southern Arizona. You can find more information about these events, their speakers, and links to register at capla.arizona.edu under the News and Information menu. So I'd now like to invite my colleague, Professor Practice Daniel Hoffman, to introduce our guest and speaker this evening.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be introducing Jonathan Bean, our colleague here at CAPLA. Jonathan is assistant professor in 2 schools of our college, the College of our college, the School of Planning and Landscape Architecture and School of Architecture, as well as an assistant professor of marketing at the Eller College of Management. Jonathan received his Bachelor of Architecture degree, Masters of Science in Architecture, and PhD at the University of California, Berkeley. His PhD research explored processes of transformation in the building industry through a study of high-performance building, an area of research that he continues to pursue in notable ways with students here at the college. Bean served as the faculty lead for a finalist team in the 2018 Race to Zero Student Design Challenge. In 2019, he led 3 finalist teams in the Solar Decathlon Design Competition. Bean is a certified Passive House consultant and serves on the board of the Passive House Alliance in the United States. Bean is also the scholarship chair for the Society of Building Science Educators. In addition to his work on high-performance building, Jonathan also researches the interaction of architecture and design with a focus on the relationship between taste and consumption, how people pick up on unspoken rules of what is acceptable within a given design approach or style. This is particularly a relevant topic for today's architects, given the matters of concern faced by the profession, issues such as climate change, diversity, and equity. How do these issues square with the high aesthetic values also promoted by the profession? Is it possible for architecture to be formally sophisticated and equitable? Is it possible for architecture to promote new construction while also being carbon neutral? These are important questions for the profession and the discipline in this critical time, questions that require the interdisciplinary approach exemplified by Jonathan Bean's work. With that, we welcome Jonathan and look forward to his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that introduction. I'm going to take just a second here to get the screen sharing up and running and confirm that you all can see a picture of me in a hole. Yes? All right, great. I'll start then. So for those of you who don't know me, or would like to know me more after Dan's talk, I was trained by a social scientist at UC Berkeley, a professor named Galen Cran. So I worked with very closely throughout my undergraduate degree, my master's, and my doctoral work. And Galen was one of the first sociologists to work in a school of architecture. She came in the 1960s, 1970s, a period when sort of the story that we like to tell ourselves is, Pruitt-Igoe failed and modernism, the project of modernism collapsed. And Galen was one of several social scientists who came to the doors of schools of architecture and urban planning and knocked on the door and said, we think that we might have an idea of what went wrong. So that's sort of my intellectual heritage and background. She's a sociologist trained at the University of Chicago. But tonight I'm going to be talking about my perspective, which is very much informed by my training as a social scientist, but also my own involvement in the field of architecture, my own immersive research. And this is a little bit of a visual joke just to show you how poor my sense of humor is. That's me standing in some water, doing some things that are related to my research. And I'd like to, this is a very speculative talk. I'd like to talk through some preliminary findings from my research and what I think that they might mean for the field of architecture and its broader relevance in a world that's facing some significant challenges, not least of which is climate change. So the core question that I have tonight is, what would architecture and architecture education in particular look like if architects considered the market as an object of design? And I know that the word market is a loaded word, and this is not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about market. What I am talking about is kind of everything that happens in our broader culture, in market-dominated society. And one really important part of that market society is narrative. So what are the stories that circulate in service of what we tell ourselves about who we are as individuals, as a culture? And for example, it's really easy to do political examples, but I think for everyone's well-being, and especially my own, go there tonight. But for people who are really invested in the Hummer brand, for example, there's a great paper about this. The narrative is a lot about personal freedom and connection with nature. There's some other really good research about American Girl dolls and about how that brand puts a story into our market about who women are in our culture, who girls are, what the proper gender roles are, how those relate to American history, and how we can sort of talk about some of the more problematic parts of American history, in particular with respect to race and slavery, through play and through toys. And broadly, this kind of phenomenon of the sort of ways that meaning gets loaded into stuff is known as market-mediated meaning. There's other ways of describing it. Narrative analysis is another one, a broader phrase. And this is very much a framework that acknowledges and starts from an acknowledgement of the existence of neoliberalism. And that is, for those of you who are not versed in that ideology, it's broadly defined as a singular ideological device that regulates nearly every corner of our culture It's not isolated popular culture or the world of finance. It's definitely present in institutions such as universities. And it's a phenomenon and effect that really naturalizes the concentration of power and resources in the hand of relatively few. So even when we deliberately choose or tell stories that resist these narratives, the 99% movement is a good example of that. Often we find ourselves kind of going back to the myth of individual exceptionalism, talking about the role of really unique people who sort of overcame barriers or boundaries. And that in itself is a neoliberal frame. So you sort of get trapped in this story, right? Like you can't get out even if you want to. And I think that we're starting to see some cracks develop. And I think that we're seeing cracks develop in the story that we're telling about who architects are, what architecture does. And I think one particular place that's very pointed and very difficult to ignore is in the need for affordable housing around the world, refugee crises, some of which are very, very close to home here in Tucson, should be very, very clear evidence of that. But there's lots of other elements as well that are causing us to sort of take a pause and say, wait a minute, what's going on? What are we doing? What's our role here? And climate change is another one. And I think that the narrative for architecture has already started to change. So this is the famous architecture article that Ed Masrio wrote, sort of launched his career and really pushed this issue into the mainstream. And Architecture 2030, of course, is still a big player, really causing us to think as a field differently about who we are and what we're doing. And the headline's really provocative, grabs your attention. It probably grabbed the attention of a lot of other people. This was back in 2003, so we still had newsstands. People left their houses, went into the world and saw. Even if you weren't an architect, you might have seen this headline. And it's really squarely placing the blame for pollution on the shoulders of architects. And that, I think, is a little bit problematic because it reflects this neoliberal tendency towards responsibilization. I'm really not sure that that's what we need, but it's what's happened and it's what's happening. So what do I mean by responsibilization? So this is a term that's usually used in studies of governmentality to refer to the process where subjects or people are rendered individually responsible for a task which previously would have been somebody else's job. So typically a state agency. So we're not going to give you food stamps anymore. You need to go out and get a job and work if you're hungry and want to eat. That's one expression, and a fairly blunt one of a neoliberal ideology. And it carries with it an implication that there's some sort of shirking of duty that's happened in the past, or that they're in some sort of imagined past that there was an individual responsibility to do this. It's been somehow removed and replaced, and then it's being put back on its proper shoulders, which is the shoulders of the individual. So let's look at this again. Like, is this cover accurate? And is it really fair to assign all of the blame to architects? And I don't think it is. And I think that we need to think really clearly and use some of the lens that we have in social science to think about the work that this does and consider that from a larger market perspective, right? So what stories does this let us tell about who we are and what we do and what our buildings do, what our design work does? And it really shifts the responsibility that was previously borne by governments and corporations onto individuals. And I think it's a really huge burden for us to carry all of this pollution. And it also frees a lot of other people from having to deal with it. And I think that's sort of the key move here, right? So if it's our fault, if it's architects' fault that buildings pollute, then we no longer need to worry about policy that restricts the amount of pollution that goes into the air. We no longer need to worry about problematic building products that make people sick, because if we're good architects, we'll just make the right choices. So this was in 2003. And this is in 2019. There are two articles. In case you can't read the headlines, I'll read them for you. The one on the left asks, where are the architects who will put the environment first? It's published in The Guardian. The other asks, what's wrong with modern buildings? And that was published in Bloomberg. So both of these are I'd say probably left-leaning publications. So ones that you would think might be a little bit critical of neoliberal tendencies or aware of them. But the answer to the question of what's wrong with modern buildings is everything, starting with how they're made. And I think that it's really difficult to imagine a more damning indictment of the architect or of what architects do. And I think we should all be troubled, regardless of our political orientations or ideas about climate change. We should all be troubled about this sort of attack on our profession, on our professional expertise, and an attack, and basically a blame for what's some really pretty horrible things that are happening to the world being placed on our shoulders. And so I think in that framework, it's really easy to understand why in 2019, just last year, the IAA passed a measure declaring a climate emergency. And from my perspective, others might have different perspectives on this, especially if they've been more deeply involved with the AIA than I have. But I think that the AIA went from being an organization that had a reputation for erring on the side of professional conservatism to one that made a highly visible activist move with clear and inescapable political and policy implications. Like if you say that there's a climate emergency, there are particular actions that you need to take as a moral actor to carry out the implications of that statement. But, and I think that this is really, really important, we need to understand that the AIA basically shouldered this huge responsibility and said, this is our job, right? And I think that it's one that, thanks to the workings of our market system, the way that those narratives that I was talking about circulate and work, I think it's going to be one that's really difficult to change. So those of you who joined earlier this year for Kielmo's lecture, and that was the first in the lecture series this fall, may sense some resonance here with his broader ideas. And I'm going to try to draw an important distinction. This is the part of my lecture that's speculative. This is a new idea that I'm working through. And I've been trying to sort of articulate how I think and really pin it down. So I would love some questions in the discussion after the lecture that would help me sharpen this point a little bit further. But I asked Kiel about how we could work to achieve change. And his answer was this: I don't have a good answer for how to deal with the monster, the bully of capital in this context. I don't think that developers have an ethics of care. I don't think we're going to change capitalism. We know what it's going to produce: toxic piles of garbage that we call condos or offices or whatever. We've been incredibly beholden, trying to make the monster less bad, less evil, less toxic. So this is I think a statement that if you really think about what he's saying here, should leave you as an architect, as a human being, at least a little bit bereft, right? Like this is one of the leading voices and figures in our field who's thinking with a high degree of sophistication about the thermal and energy flows that go into buildings, the labor that they organize, and doesn't really have an idea for how we can change course, how we can change the direction the ship is going. And so I'm trying to make a distinction here, both in that I think just as a human being, I'm not willing to give up and throw in the towel. And I'm also trying to understand how, based on kind of who we are as architects, how our field got here in terms of the history and its legacy, how to think about this in a different way or a different framework that might be more productive, that might eventually lead us to a solution. So I'm not going to be able to answer the question tonight. So if that's what you're waiting for, you could sign off of Zoom now. But I'm using the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu's theory of distinction here as a start. This theory talks a lot about fields. I'm not going to have time to really adequately define them tonight. So I'm going to use a shorthand that is really not adequate, but it's the best to do in a short period of time. You can think about a field, a cultural field, as operating something akin to the field where you might play a game of football or soccer. So there's boundaries, there's rules for what you can and can't do, can and can't play the game, what happens if you break the rules of the game, and so forth. And so the way that we think about architecture is that we have a field of the way that we often think about it is that we have a field of restricted production where only certain people or some people can get in. And we have a field of action and is open to more people. We're used to thinking about architecture as operating over here in the field of restricted production. And the analog then to architecture is building. And building definitely operates in the field of mass production, right? So one of the things that distinguishes architecture from mere building is the fact that there's something sort of special about it, right? Something that can only be appreciated by some people. And that means that there's a status hierarchy operating in the field, both within and across these two fields. So architecture in general is higher status than building. And some forms of architecture, so like a museum building, for example, has a lot more status than others, a house or industrial building, right? So if you're an architect that designs warehouses, you don't have as much social status as an architect that designs world famous museum buildings. And similarly, if you're a builder that designs or that builds really big corporate office buildings, you have more status than a builder that is building tract housing. So the theory and then these related and embedded status hierarchies are really deeply internalized within our field. And this has been shown over and over and over again by sociologists who study the field. And I think we can get kind of locked into this way of looking at things. But the problem is that this theory doesn't account for what's happened in the last 20 years as sort of neoliberalism has expanded its grip and really reoriented the way that we think and work and function as cultures. So we could envision it now as looking something like this. So the field of mass production just sort of ate, like Pac-Man style, the field of restricted production. And whereas before there was a somewhat sizable portion of the field that could at least claim to operate free of the encumbrances of the market, now almost all of us, and including those in the field of restricted production, are trapped in the logic of the field of mass production, whether we want to be there or not. And I think that this is actually a very, this lens offers a very clear way to understand the emergence and the performance and the kind of work that starchitects, as we call them, like Rem Koolhaas and Daniel Libeskind and Zaha Hadid and Bjarne Ingels do. They operate according to the market logic of person brands. There's a vector on this. Person brands are entities, I'll say, not necessarily people, like Elon Musk or Bill Nye or Martha Stewart. And you can see some of those hallmarks of neoliberalization, including financialization, in the role the architect's name alone has to play in the economic value of a building. So this was, this became the Bilbao effect. You build a building that's done by a famous architect, it has an eye-catching design, and it functions as an economic anchor for redevelopment of a city. So the architect's value and the ultimate measure of aesthetic qualities is translated into economic value, and not just sort of a dollars and cents calculation of economic value, but a measure of how much capital can be moved from one place to another with the architecture produced by the architect as the vehicle. So going back to the theory, I think that this leaves us with a choice, and this is where Mo and I go two different directions. So one option is to try to redraw completely the boundaries of the fields, and so that we can exist in some other logic. And I think Mo and I both agree on this. It's not likely to happen. Capitalism is too much, in his words, it's too much of a bully, too much of a monster, and we're trapped in this system. So if we take that off the table, I think we have two pragmatic choices. We can first try to shrink architecture so that it fits back into the field of restricted production. And in my view, this is a stance where we are more or less hiding behind the veil of aesthetic innovation to justify a position where architects who get famous continue to comfortably design museums and houses for fancy people and not really worry about climate change in a meaningful way, because it's not going to impact their livelihoods, the people that they design for. And I think that this is a comfortable position or a familiar one for our field, because the primary measure of achievement, and this is borne out again by many studies by sociologists of the field and of the education in the field, is aesthetic innovation. And coming from another perspective, the sociologist Hannah Wohl, who worked with Gary Allen Fine, who's renowned for his work on group formation, on taste cultures. She built up from the work of Antoine Agnon to show how shared judgments in the world of art are really efficient group makers. So if we share a common judgment of that one particular form or one particular work of art is in fact art and is really exceptional art, we can all kind of form a group around that shared identity. And a really key finding from her work is this, and it gets back to architecture, so bear with me for just a minute. I know I've gone deep down into theory land. So she says that when group identification is nascent or in flux or becomes destabilized, aesthetic judgments have a more significant impact on groupness, as members must now more actively negotiate group identification. So in the context of the field of architecture, I have seen that group identification is most certainly in flux. And I think that it's become destabilized because of the shift towards sustainability. It's making us do things in much different ways than we're used to. So if we go back to this theory of mass production, or sorry, the field of mass production, the field of restricted production, if architecture shrinks into this field of restricted production, building is just going to expand to fill the void. And I think if this happens, architecture will effectively give up its claim to authority over the majority of the built environment. And this is a really good time to remind you that the Architecture 2030 projection is that, which is broadly agreed upon, projects that there'll be urban development equivalent to adding 1 New York City's worth of buildings to the planet every month for the next 40 years. I'll just say that one more time. The projection is that every month for the next 40 years, we're going to add 1 New York City's worth of buildings to the planet. That's a lot of buildings. It would be really nice to have those buildings designed by architects, I think. The alternate strategy is that we can enlarge architecture within the field of mass production and maybe start to poke on those boundaries a little bit. And if we're going to do that, we need to change the story that we're telling about what architecture is and can do. And I just want to highlight and point out, I think that some people find this threatening, right? Or debasing or degrading, that architecture should somehow lower itself to deal with the field of mass production. And that is very much and very strongly related to the legacy of the status hierarchies that are built into our field. But we can keep the status hierarchies. And in fact, I think we're going to the status hierarchies. They're part of our culture that we're stuck with, despite many good attempts to get rid of them. And so what I'm proposing is really an expansion of the field that can still engage the field of restricted production, can engage better the field of building, and that rather than trying to reimpose a logic of the field of restricted production on the field of mass production to make every building sort of an aesthetic work of art that sort of has some sort of internal, right? I think that regardless of how good of an idea of it, that is, how much of that describes a world that I personally would like to live in, I think if we study history and the logic of neoliberalism, if we pay attention to current events, we know that this is just not going to work. It's not a feasible future. So where does that leave us? Well, I think it's really interesting that the AIA framework for design excellence has effectively redefined design excellence. And that's like at the core of architecture, right? That's the thing that differentiates architecture from mere building, is this thing that we call beauty. And everything has been reorganized around this new imperative. Now, beauty is still there. It's in design for integration. But the point of this framework is that it should be relevant to every project, regardless of size, typology, or aspiration. And this sort of gives away the ambition of this project, right? This is a real shift for the field. It's saying that the baseline for excellent design is that it has to be sustainable, resilient, and inclusive, and 7 other things at the same time. So I think you can look at this in from 2 different perspectives. We can use the concept of the fields, and we can come at this from the field of restricted production. And if we do that with a critical, or one might even say a really cynical viewpoint, it's easy to paint things like this and other third-party standards as alibis for neoliberal development. And it's like we're saying to architects, just do this stuff and we're going to look the other way. And it's okay, the buildings that you design can continue to perpetuate problematic transfers of wealth, continue the climate crisis, perpetuate inequity, whatever. We're just going to stamp it and give you a plaque to mount on the wall. And it's sort of moral license to do whatever you want. I think we could also look at these with perhaps a less cynical perspective and say, these measures and other tools like them are potential tools that we can use to reorganize our market system. Now, they're not the only tools that we need to reorganize a market system. But we can acknowledge the importance of changing the practices of a whole range of actors beyond architects. And that would include policymakers, building product corporations, ecosystems. And I don't think it takes long to realize that most of these areas require skills that well beyond what's traditionally taught in architecture school, planning schools, landscape architecture, and that actually have little to do with the emphasis on formal innovation that continues to drive distinction in our field, both in terms of the profession and in the schools. Another way of thinking about this is to think about the taste regime that is in operation behind the scenes. So this is a concept that I defined in a paper that's been fairly influential in the field of marketing. And the idea is the taste regime is that thing that regulates the allowable set of relationships between objects, meanings, and doings. And the context for our original research was a design blog and a book called Apartment Therapy. It was one of the first big internet websites, sort of the first big media brands online that displaced things like Better Homes and Gardens and Martha Stewart Living and Domino magazine the first time around. Actually sort of coincided with what was thought to be the collapse of print publishing. So this blog was very influential. And one of the ideas that was promoted both in the blog and in the book was that every house, every apartment needs some sort of what they called landing strip. So this is an area inside your front door, near your front door, where you sort of take off your coat and hang it up. You have a place to sit down so you can take off or put on your shoes. You can charge your phone, you can hang up your keys. And what was interesting about this was not just like, hey, this is a practical way to manage all of the crap that accumulates in our daily lives of coming and going back when people left their houses, but also that this was framed in this particular taste regime as a way to make your home feel calm and orderly. And as not just as a way to make your home feel calm and orderly, but as a way for you yourself as a person to feel calm and orderly. So this is very much linked to this neoliberal concept of responsibilization and instrumentalization of really making the individual subject sort of take on the sort of pressures of the world and then resolve them through consumption decisions. So I think that we can look at the framework for design excellence as an attempt to re-regulate the taste regime of architecture. And that's this network of objects, meanings, and doings that are involved in architecture. So if you take that on, as our 4th year students are right now, you have to relate a whole new set of doings. You have to measure a whole bunch of stuff and run some calculations. And if you're an architect that builds and really buys into the properties of design, the measures of design excellence, you're going to do a post-occupancy evaluation, which is something that's only very rarely done now. And you're going to attach those things to a new set of objects that are quantitatively and qualitatively different than the kinds of buildings and plans that we produced before as architects. And you're going to link those things to a new set of meanings, including building and quality, equity, responsibility, sustainability, and professionalism. So there's really a reworking here of what it means to be an architect, what architecture is in the broader world, and what's considered good and bad architecture. And we're not really equipped with the language to talk about this because it's something that we've been trained to kind of conveniently ignore, I think. So the question is, if we don't acknowledge the role of taste and these relationships between objects, meanings, and doings, and the way that they relate to broader narratives about what architecture is and does in our culture, can we redesign the public face of architecture? Or will it be redesigned for us? And this is the possibility that I personally find a little bit terrifying. And you probably all saw this. It made a splash earlier this year, back in February, if you can remember back that far. But this was the idea to make federal architecture great again. Now, this did trigger a really broad and resounding line of resistance. So the AIA very clearly said, no, we are not going to go for uniform style mandates. We think that we need to have the freedom to design in any way that we want. And I think that this is really interesting. You know, if you walk into a review, as long as you're not at Notre Dame, and somebody's got a set of Corinthian columns on a building or a dome, there's usually a pretty chilly reception in the review to that project. So we do have some implicit guidelines about what kind of style is acceptable within our field. And I think we need to have a much more honest discussion about what flies and what doesn't. I think that this really matters, and it matters at this point in time with all of this emphasis and interest in sustainability hugely, because we've seen this happen before, kind of at a similar moment of cultural transition after the Second World War. And in this case, it was Elizabeth Gordon. She was the editor of House Beautiful, which was widely circulated and influential magazine at the time. And she wrote this very provocative editorial called The Threat to the Next America. And what is the threat to the next America? It's buildings that look like this, right? It is what she called the international style, with flat roofs and smooth surfaces, and walls that look like Mondrian compositions. And she had a preference for a softer, gentler form of modernism that was exemplified by the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, who she tirelessly promoted in the paper House Beautiful. And I'd just like to point out here that Gordon wasn't an architect, basically just a person with strong opinions in an influential position. And she had the means to create what the sociologist Hannah Wall calls shared meaning and form. And we would probably use the word visual appearance as architects, or a project aesthetic, or project concept, but there's a nod here that there's a reference to a very material thing. And if I can dip my toe just a tiny bit into politics and our current reality, you can think about what wearing a mask means to some people. It's a mark of protection and care for others, and how for other people, it's a mark of conformity, of compliance with an overreach of government, or even belief in something that doesn't exist, if you really want to go to the far end of the pole. So this gets at what Wohl refers to as a visceral experience of form. So as I was talking about the masks, I don't know about you, but I have a personal, like a very strong embodied reaction to seeing someone with a mask versus not seeing someone with a mask. And that's what Wohl is talking about here, with this visceral experience of form, that we feel that some forms are right and some forms are wrong. And this influences the way that we see our group identity and that we form groups. So it's a little bit tricky now to think about the way that architecture works, and the way that architecture might work as a discipline with aesthetics so firmly at its center. So I think we need to equip the field to redesign the market systems that define the boundaries of architecture. I think that if we don't do it, it's going to be done for us. I'm not sure we're going to like the results. And I think to do this, we need to study examples like Elizabeth Gordon, of people who have reshaped the boundaries of the field for better or for worse. one last long quote from Hannah Wall. And just to underline how difficult this is working within an aesthetically oriented culture, such as architecture, or you can think about it in a different context. Sometimes things are clear to see into context, but take street racing, right? This is a street racing get together. So our group identity, just like the group of people who are here at the car show, our group identity is rooted in affiliation with a specific vocabulary of form, right? You don't see any like lowriders here. You don't see any cars from the 1950s. You don't see any SUVs for that reason. There's a uniform expression of acceptable form for this particular group, this particular culture. And so in Wall's language, repeated intersubjective validations of aesthetic judgments can concretize the collective sense of belonging to the group as members come to see themselves as sharing a community sense. In turn, feelings of belonging tend to nudge members towards agreement. So even if I'm unlikely to agree with you, the fact that I'm part of the group means that I'm more likely to change my opinion to match yours. And this last part is really incredibly important. Intersubjective validation stabilizes into a public face of taste, which is always vulnerable to being undermined by communicated disagreements in aesthetic judgments. And what she means by this is that when we disagree in public over what something should look like, that disagreement isn't just a matter of taste, but that disagreement has deep, deep consequences for the processes of group formation and group solidity. And this is sort of multiplied because our field is still largely operating on what I see as an erroneous basis that architecture operates only according to this logic of the field of restricted production. And status gets mixed up with these aesthetic distinctions that further limits the potential of the field because it sends a message to people who don't have the right taste that they don't belong. Either in our students' fields, either in our field as students, as professionals, or as users of architecture. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately as we've had more discussions about diversity and inclusion, and as we've really confronted some of the failures, quite frankly, of the field of architecture in particular, with bringing, just at the most basic level, gender equity into the profession. We failed at that and failed at most other measures of diversity as well. But in case you're unclear on this, there are blogs like McMansion Hell that will call out other people's bad taste in excruciating detail. There are also blogs like Unhappy Hipsters that let you poke fun at your own good taste, which sort of diminishes its impact, right? Like, oh, I can make fun of myself, so it doesn't really matter that much. That there are some particular messages encoded in environments that look like this that might be unwelcoming to large numbers of other people. And I think that taste also operates in architecture in other ways that are perhaps just as impactful. So in my research on the passive house movement in the United States, I have seen it preemptively dismissed over and over again by people who have absolutely no understanding of what it actually is or involves, because they see it as generating boxy, conservative, or ugly architecture. This is an example. I would say that this is boxy and perhaps conservative, but probably not ugly. But I've seen this in my research over and over and over again. And you hear things like people saying, oh, this is just so boring. So that's a way to demonstrate status. It places the project lower in the scale. It's a narrative strategy that has impacts within the field. So that decreases the likelihood that that particular project is going to be used as a precedent in the studio class, even though it's an amazing example of reducing the energy impact of a building in a very challenging climate. And the broader narrative of what we see as architecture in general, right? And what's worthy to talk about as architecture. So we're more likely to see things like this. This was featured just 2 days ago on Dezeen. It's a budget project done by a big name architect, work I tend to like in general. Have you not gotten the memo that the ceilings are going to rise? Is it a good idea to build a bunch of houses of a C right now? Maybe not, but the form overall is compliant with what our ideas of architecture should look like. So I think perhaps this is a better way of, we really need to train our resources as professionals, as educators, on creating more people, and I think that that's really our students, who can effectively shape public discourse and who can rework the market systems that now stand in the way of architecture's full potential. There are so many examples in social science. I'm just going to highlight one of them that I think is really powerful and really instructive. So gambling used to be something that only really shady people did, right? If you gambled, you were sort of considered morally suspect. It was done in the back room. You did it out of sight of other people. You didn't really talk about it with your friends. But starting in the 1980s and going through the 1990s and 2000s, we saw a big shift. Gambling became gaming. And gaming is okay. Gambling is bad, right? And this was a very intentional, very deliberately constructed shift in the discourse that had a lot of big players behind it. But you can see it here. It's now even reflected in the structure of our government. There's a billboard version of this sign up for years out by the Tucson airports. You might have seen it there, but it says, "I have gamble less, often power." And it's put up by the Arizona Department of Gaming. So that's the big division, or that's the big government agency. And then they have a division of problem gambling. So just in case you're not clear on that. But the way that we talk about these things really matters. And so I think that there's a clear parallel here about how we talk about what architecture is and can do. And that's why, going back to these newspaper articles, that I get so nervous when I see headlines like this. I think we are foundering for a response to the question of what's wrong with modern buildings. And I think that other fields might be better equipped to offer answers than architecture is. I think it's also to remember that there are external factors at play that are altering the story that we can tell as architects. So a couple of things, most people now know of Greta Thunberg and her amazing work in shifting the narrative around climate change. But even before Greta Thunberg, research from Pew shows that most young people believe that climate change is real and that we should at least try to do something about it. So we really need a relevant, resonant, and easy to digest story about what architecture is and what architecture can do. I get depressed every year when I teach this chapter from Victor Papanek's book, but this year I actually cried. He says, watching children far away dying on your color TV set while sipping a frost-beaded martini can be kicks for lots of people, but only until your town burns down. And as I was reading this, I was reading about seeing the evidence of the massive fires in Oregon, one of which started at the campground that I go to every year. So to an engaged designer, this way of life, this lack of design is not acceptable. And you'd think that over the last 50 years, we could have put ourselves as designers collectively in a better position, at least to reduce the amount of inequity in the world. So I'm going to talk about very briefly here, about three findings. They're just provocations, and these are intended to sort of help me think more clearly about a paper that I'm writing for an audience of sociologists that come out of my experience working as a Passive House consultant, working on the board member of a Passive House organization, working with student teams in the Solar Decathlon Design Challenge, and some other experiences I've had in the field. So the first observation, provocation, finding, is that building science has emerged as a discipline that has the potential to displace the field of architecture's claim to authority over the built environment. There are some really powerful players behind this, not least is the US government. And their power has been a little bit blunted in the last 4 years because this is affiliated with the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. But I think if we see the Build Back Better plan roll out, we're going to see a real push for building science and a real significant investment in building science that could really rewrite sort of the contours of the field of architecture and perhaps erode it. The other thing I'm seeing is that codes and voluntary standards are increasingly determining the professional remit of architecture. So clients are coming to architects and saying, we want you to design to this particular standard. And the architect is saying, okay, because that's what their client wants. And that's good. But I think it's also worth looking at who's writing those codes and standards. So typically the answer is a bunch of engineers and some policy wonks, to put it a little bit crudely. I'm a member of this particular committee that's writing a passive building design standard. And the stated intent is that it should be applicable to all new and existing buildings intended for human occupancy. So it would be nice if more architects were involved in the writing of standards such as these. The third finding is that division and duplicated effort within the field of architecture are undermining the potential for change. So, and I'm going to go back to form here. And what I mean by this is that the way that we define and police the boundaries of the field of architecture is inextricably linked to questions of style and taste, but we don't talk about these things. It's really infrequently discussed and almost sort of feels illicit to talk about it, especially if you talk about it as style, right? That's not something that we talk about. That's not a word that we use as architects. And Cameron Tonkinwise, who's active in the world of design theory, makes a provocative claim that the reason that we don't talk about styling is that it frees design from implied responsibility for gratuitous consumption. That styling is something you do to appeal to a consumer, to appeal to a market, to appeal to those people who are operating in the field of mass production. So transgression, or it's an acknowledgement you're not actually operating in the field of restricted production, and that you've sort of lowered or debased yourself if you're working on these working from this theory of fields. And so Jean Gang, who's an architect who wrote really passionately about the need for better design for big buildings, she got a lot of press. Her firm got a lot of positive press for the Aqua Tower, but also a lot of really negative press for its thermal functioning. One person called it a giant radiator on the Chicago skyline, but completely lost in all of the representation of the story. So the story was Jean Gang made a beautiful building. Too bad it's a thermal disaster. The reason was why it's a thermal disaster. She designed thermal breaks in. They were value engineered out by the developer who built this building for profit. So the developer said, it's not my problem. Somebody else is going to pay for the energy. I don't care. We're not going to build them. We're not going to build them into this project. So I think that there's three potentials with respect to the broader field and with respect to my area of influence, which is education. So first, in response to the growing influence of building science, I think that we need to very strongly as a field build calculative abilities in our students and our professionals by framing architecture as very much art and as a science. And that does not mean that we need to send everyone out to learn energy modeling. It does not mean that everybody needs to become a whiz in SPSS or Grasshopper, but it does mean that we need to take control of the design tools that we have and reveal to students the calculative capacity already built into those tools. So there's a paper from the field of market studies, again, a sociology paper, that talks about the shopping cart as a calculative device. So when you put something in a shopping cart, you're committing to buying it. When you put more things in a shopping cart, that first thing that you put in is more difficult to remove from the shopping cart, right? You're kind of locking yourself in to buying the stuff at the bottom of the cart. And for many of us, we know that when the cart is full, that's about $200 worth of groceries, probably time to stop, right? And go to the front of the store and check out. So this is a way that that calculation is actually built into things. And so we need to think about the ways that calculation is built into the things that we use and make and build as architects. There's some really clever ways to do this. This is Kilmo. This project I find very inspiring and quite clever, right? It's a form of Trojan horse because it looks like a formal exercise, but what it really is an exercise that introduces a pretty sophisticated understanding of thermodynamic flows. So the assignment here is to create one form that in one configuration expels or rejects energy, and in another form or another configuration collects energy. The second potential, I think, that we can treat code, policy, and standards as a co-equal object of design. So we need to celebrate architects like Chris Benedict. And Chris Benedict does a lot of nonprofit housing retrofits in New York City. And she famously said, insulation is activism. And she pushed and pushed and pushed relentlessly in New York City to get the code changed so that she could add 6 inches of exterior insulation on the roof surface of a building and exceed the allotted height, the height restriction allotted to the building. Critical, if you have a basic understanding of building science, this is a critical move in this particular climate if you're going to design a building that doesn't use a lot of energy and also doesn't rot to pieces. So these kinds of things, I think we really need to celebrate. The third provocation and potential is that we could augment the established role of the architect as a boundary spanner by encouraging both specialization and diversity within the field. So the reality is that, and this isn't speculative at all, this is the range of specializations you'll find right now in a medium to big architecture office. And I firmly believe, and I will fight for university education, always aiming first to build capacities for critical training, or sorry, for critical thinking and transformative thought. I do not believe that our role is merely to prepare people for professional work. Our curriculum could definitely better prepare students to in between these existing areas of specialization. I also wonder that if what the effect would have on the diversity problem that we have as a field, if we could do 2 things. First of all, encourage people to pursue different specializations within architecture, because I've seen in my own experience some very talented students leave and become engineers or go off and become artists because the particular way that they want an architect isn't represented in the education, although it is definitely represented out there in the field. And I also think that it could help us build a more diverse, in every measure, group of students if we can influence, if we can build teamwork into the way that we're teaching and educating students. So that's where I'll end. I would love to answer questions. I'll see if I can, yep, in the slide share. I can bring it back up if there are particular questions that you'd like, or particular slides that you'd like me to reference.
Thank you, Jonathan. Very provocative and inspiring. Yeah, Laura, go ahead, please.
I have a question. Thanks so much, Jonathan. That's really fun. And you took us through a lot of different issues, nicely interwoven. I have a question about, I think it was maybe the first of the Hannah Vole quotations that you showed and discussed, the one about when group identity is in flux, aesthetic judgments, I think the wording in the sentence was play a stronger role in forging group identity. And I was, as you went on, I was asking myself, well, stronger than what? Stronger than when identity is not in flux? I could imagine that, but I'm also wondering whether you think she's really making an argument just about aesthetic judgment, because I feel like I could substitute in that phrase political judgment, and it would also be true. So I wanted to ask you about the scope of that assertion.
Yeah. So what she says is when group identification is nascent or in flux or becomes destabilized, aesthetic judgments have a more significant impact on groupness, as members must more actively negotiate group identification. And the comparison, the implicit comparison, is when group identification is stable, that you that you can have more aesthetic variation within a group when the boundaries around that group aren't being contested or aren't in tension. And so I think that from like sort of crossing the boundary, I think what happened, what the AIA declaration of a climate emergency did, was really throw the field from a position where the boundaries around what architecture was were relatively stable and recognized, and all of a sudden it was like, whoa, we're doing this, okay, right? And where are the boundaries, and how do you become an architect that does this kind of work? So that to me is the implicit comparison there. And I think that the way that the word aesthetic is used and form is used within this particular literature, sociology literature, it's really, I was trying to figure out a way to describe it for the talk, but the mask example was sort of the best that I could come up with, right? So there's this idea of form, and maybe Laura, as an art historian, you can help me with this, but there's this idea of a form as being something that has a symbolic meaning and a material presence kind of collapsed onto one another, that those two things are inseparable from each other. So in that perspective, a political viewpoint is an aesthetic judgment, right? Like that it's wrapped up with all the ways that you express that. So I think we saw that really well.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree. And I guess I'm just, I'm really trying to think about what the valence of the aesthetic is. And we could talk further about whether aesthetic is the right term there or not, but sort of what the valence and what the power of that is in these larger social contexts. So it's a fascinating question, and I appreciate being introduced to that sociologist whose work I don't know. So
yeah, she worked with Gary Ellen Fine as a PhD student at Northwestern, and she's just recently finished her dissertation and started a position. So it's exciting to see somebody with young and new and energetic in the field who's having, really answering some pretty deep questions, unresolved questions.
Thank you.
Rob, do you want to read your question? Do you want
I'll just ask it if that's okay.
Yep.
Thanks, Beth.
Yep.
So Jonathan, this is really, really interesting, and I love the scope of your thesis about mass production and architects getting left behind because we're too committed and narrow-minded to a traditional trajectory. It kind of reminds me of the change from the late 19th century neoclassical tradition into the fractured and then growing modern stuff. And in that case, I would say architects, as we knew them in the 19th century, just got left behind, became irrelevant, and the whole thing had to be reinvented through, arts and crafts and Bauhaus and all those fringe movements. Are we going to do that again? Are we going to dump out the whole thing and start over, or is there a way to build this forward from where we are? Great talk, thank you.
I think that's a difficult question. That's what I'm still trying to figure out. There's some hints of answers in the broader literature on market systems about market emergence and market formation, and those papers talk about how particular groups of people or particular groups of people and things can come together and organize and catalyze, is one word that's often used in that literature, and sort of touch off a emergence of a new way of thinking. There's also, from a different perspective, a different body of literature, there's this idea of multi-level perspective. And that's really strongly associated now with a field called the sustainability transitions movement. And the idea is that we need to sort of figure out how we're going to get to a post-carbon economy. And in that perspective, this multi-level perspective, it's almost like an ecological metaphor where you can imagine like an ocean floor. You have like lots of little different niches where different ideas kind of incubate while, and then one pops up into this like meso level. And then only now and then do things go from that meso level up into the macro level of culture and really reorganize or reorient things. So I think that what could be done is that some of these frameworks and tools could be kind of tested out, right? Like all right, we're here. We know where we are. We know where we want to go. And we know that if we don't go there, someone else is going to get there first, right? So you could use these different theories as ways to test out different courses of action and try to understand their impacts and their likely effects. But I don't know if I figured that out, I'll let you know.
Good, thank you. Great talk, really great talk.
Thanks.
Trevor.
Hey, Jonathan.
Hi, Trevor.
My question is more kind of back to this broader idea about a neoliberal framework, I guess, and kind of architects operating in that. How much do you think architects should try to understand the kind of financial logic behind that and say co-opt it for change, trying to kind of work within those parameters? And how much do you think architects should pretty much seek alternate economic solutions maybe to, that the existing system can't provide?
Oh, I'll give you a couple of examples from my research. So I think number one, you could be like, blow up the system and create something entirely new and different. And I think that if you have the support of, say, a university position or some other source of income that can support you in the creation and dissemination of those ideas, great, go for it, right? Like that's a really valid strategy. But not everyone has those resources at their disposal. So I think you can also look at, I'm thinking Chris Benedict is actually a really good example of this. So Chris got into the financial, into the financial muck and got the spreadsheets and figured things out. And in the context of affordable housing, realized that there were a couple of issues. One issue was that the pots of money that pay for the construction and maintenance of the building are distinct from the pots of money that are used for to pay for utilities and pay for energy. So you can kind of work on that, right? Like you could redesign those relationships, and that actually redesigns the potential for the building. The other thing that she realized is that baked into some of the financial assumptions that her clients were making were things like, you have to replace the windows every 15 years in a building because they wear out in an inexpensive building. And so she said, well, what if we put windows in that last 40 or 50 years and you don't have to replace them in 15 years? And the client said, that would be good. And then that opened up a different pathway for going forward. So I think that that's like, I think that is answering your question a little bit. But I think in general, architects would be well served to really understand better the functionings of the real estate market, the functionings of the capital markets, the way that those things influence design decisions. I mean, I can't tell you how many conferences I've been to where really well-intentioned, very smart architects stand on a stage and proudly declare, we did this project and it was only 2% more expensive. And it's like every developer in the audience just said, nope, we're not going to do that, right? Like every single one. So I think that that's sort of the minimum threshold for understanding, right? We have to, that's a basic fluency, just like understanding how to draw a section to me.
Yeah, that, I guess, adding that kind of understanding into the hats that the architects might wear, right? Yeah.
And this is always the problem, it's like, well, if we knew everything, we could do everything. So what do we teach and what don't we teach?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Michael, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that a little bit. So I'm a practicing architect and recently been working more on development projects. I've normally done more civic projects and government projects, which are funded in a whole different way. But this idea of the financial, like how these projects financially work, is critically important, because what I've come to realize is there's like this matrix-like background that the pro forma of the developer is what determines the future of these projects. And things like, green building features and aesthetics, it all plays into that pro forma for them to determine what their profitability of those projects are. Mm-hmm. And I guess being inside, where from my perspective, like trying to figure out how to shift this system in a way that becomes more socially responsible. It's such a huge mechanism right now, like how this whole financial system that backs these projects work. I don't know if you have any advice in terms of like how can we, as as architects, shift this system, because the way the financing works, I'm sure you're familiar with, is they have numbers they need to meet to get the return on the investment, and it's all built from this financial model.
Right.
drives
So
it.
a couple of ideas. One is that if you have a project where the model is to build it and sell it a couple of years later or immediately upon, like don't even engage, like the ship has sailed, like there's nothing you can do. A little bit of a surprise for me, this qualified opportunity zone legislation, which you might be familiar with. If you're not, you could look into it. But it's created an incentive for developers to hold on to projects now, because if they hold on to it for 10 or 15 years, the capital gains tax is forgiven and they can pass that along to their investors. So all of a sudden, there's the need to look further down the line in projects. And I think that if you understand how the performer works, if you really get in there, you can start to do things like Chris did and say, wait a minute, like, do you really want to replace all the windows right before you sell this building 15 years from now? Or how about we just put better ones in now and look at how the net present value of that works out, and see if it's a discussion that you can have. I think where the broader point of the talk, or the broader picture of the talk, and then where I started with sort of the narratives that we're talking and they're circulated in culture, this is where it's like the connective tissue like needs to be developed, because what we need to be doing as a profession is saying the way that we value these things is not good. I was going to say it's wrong. That's a freighted word, but it's not getting us the results that we want, right? And we need to think very differently about how to rework that. And there's lots of tools out there. I mean, just there's that triple bottom line idea to start off with. There are other ways of approaching the problem, but we need to work on this sort of in parallel. And I think that that's a lot to ask of any individual practitioner or even any small firm. But maybe we could ask it of some of the bigger firms. We could definitely ask it of the AIA, right? And I think that they're largely pointed in that direction. But I think we've have a focus right now on changing policies, and we need to go like up a meta level and say, what's the story we're telling? Like, who are we, right, as a field, and like what value do we have? What value can we offer? And there are different ways that this works out. The field of medicine has really gone to great lengths to defend the authority of doctors and other medical professionals. They've all institutionalized mechanisms to limit the doctors there are graduated from medical schools. And so we haven't done that in the world of architecture. And our financial value as individuals is limited because of an oversupply, or maybe not right now, but at times there is definitely an oversupply.
Thanks.
Sure.
I have a question, Jonathan.
Oh no.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. Tried to follow all the different threads. Very complex weave. But near the end of your talk, you spoke about these 3 findings. And I think the findings were meant as findings in relationship to how we might proceed with architectural education, if I'm not mistaken, or tools for the young architects, as it were.
Yeah, potentials, I call them.
Yeah, to enter into this world. So if I were to look at them, it's there's a greater awareness of the, in no particular order, importance of building science. As you said, that building science might end up doing the work of architects if you don't watch out. Codes, the importance of codes, and the inevitability of specializations that occur within practice. I think those are the 3, and in recognition of that. And I think they're served up as kind of a response to the initial question that you raised about ultimately the relevance of architecture as we seem to understand it in our culture. It seems that these technologically based hedges are your strategy. That if we, in the end, accept that architecture is going to become and is, well, apparently is now more technical by nature, that's a kind of area that we can potentially control more.
Mhm.
So I just find that interesting that technology emerges as the solution, you know. And what's interesting, particularly say with regard to codes, and just speaking as an person who was involved in practice for a while,
Mhm.
you know, increasingly practices are becoming specialized because of the increasing technical demands. So if you're, you know, housing is extremely, you know, determined in terms of all the technical demands, even though they might not be energy sufficient, there's many technical demands to
Mhm.
making a cost-efficient housing project. So, you know, I don't believe that. So in a way, you're serving up technology as a kind of solution, in a way, and that formal issues will just take care of themselves within the profession if we protect ourselves within this kind of framework of technology. And mass production, if anything, is technological. Mass production is. That's what determines mass production, is the you know, the ability to master the technological systems of mass production. So that's what just seemed to be the answer to the aesthetic question. So in a way, you defer it, say, well, if we're technical, we're going to take care of this other stuff. That's not going to be so important anymore because our refuge is within our technical kind of strength and ability to be adept and manage the situations that we face. So that's the sense. Is that, well, that's my sense.
Yeah, I think that you're getting the motivation for some of what I'm suggesting, but maybe not the implication or the or you're overreading the implication of current practice. So I think that this is what I'm proposing is an expansion of what we're doing, not a displacement of what we're currently doing. So I think we need to do everything we're already doing, plus do more stuff. And I know that for everyone who's teaching online right now, you want to fall off your chair when I say that. But I think the other thing here is it's not so much technological, specific technological capabilities that I'm arguing for, but it's a reframing of architecture so that it can include the technical aspects rather than have those separated off and given to another profession. So the potentials I'm talking about say, like, let's sort of reframe, intellectually reframe architecture as an art and a science together. Let's treat code, policy, and standards as an object of design, like just like we treat buildings as an object of design. And let's teach students the social skills that they need to function as a specialist. So that, of course, means you're going to give some people specific technical skills. But I think for me, it's really it's creating both it's legitimizing the claim of authority. That's what's really important in a society that's increasingly reliant on the technical. That we need to include that within the boundaries of the field, and also that we are building off, you know, the business people call these the soft skills, being able to communicate what it is we do and what our value is.
Well, it's interesting. Architectural education used to be way more technical than it is today. To be educated as an architect in the 50s and into the 60s,
mm-hmm.
you had to command a greater, you needed size elements in your building structurally. You need to, it's the actual technical kind of requirements are actually curiously less, even though in fact, in practice, they're much more in reality. So it's interesting. Anyway, we can go on and on. I just think that what I'm trying to say and get to is that, in a way that I'm skeptical that by not addressing aesthetics, or by you're doing a feint move by saying, well, let's do technology rather than aesthetics, that will take care of itself. And I think that in a way, that's an abdication of sorts, in a way.
I think what
That's
I'm
my,
trying to
that's my,
say, Dan,
that's
is
my
that
skepticism.
if we don't do the technology, the number of projects on which we can do aesthetics is going to dwindle.
To be
Yeah.
sure.
I think Beth is trying to get back in.
Yeah,
there.
well, actually, I think that's a really good segue to Rob's other question.
Oh, okay. Which is
Am I
electric.
back, Beth?
Oh, yes, please ask your question.
Yeah, so, yeah, as Dan says, I keep trying to think through this problem by learning from what's happening in the auto industry. And the huge change in what a car is and how we think about it is more than performance. We're in the middle of a real conceptual change. Cars are gonna very soon be able to last for 1 million miles. They're much cheaper already to operate than our ICE vehicles. But this change happened not because of those performative benefits. It changed because somebody created an intense desire for this. And then the rest of it followed. I'm just wondering if we need to learn from that model. I don't know, what do you think, Jonathan?
I think that's done, and that goes like to the narrative, and some people call this marketplace myths. So electric car is an amazing example because you can think back to the first mass-produced electric vehicle in the US, which is a GM EV, which looked like a banana, and it worked really well. The people who bought it liked it. But it sort of had the same fate as the first generation, or as the Toyota Prius. It became like a car for like environmental nerds. And I should disclose that I have owned several Toyota Priuses. So, but right, what happens is that somebody comes along and tells us a better story about what an electric car can be. It's Elon Musk, who's a person brand, right? Like not an entrepreneur. He's very much a person brand. And now you can go buy and be part of that story by buying and driving a Tesla. And that general approach of like a car is excitement, a car is freedom, is now getting picked up by other manufacturers. So Ford has working with some really smart management consultants, sort of created a new story about American ingenuity, and you're about to see that told in the form of the new Ford E-Mustang. So I think those are really excellent examples of kind of what we need. And the question is, do we tell those stories about buildings? Do we tell those stories about architects? What's the form and the content of the story that we tell, and who's going to tell it? Like who has the cultural, and then this goes back to Dan's question of like, who has the cultural authority to command attention and say, I'm going to tell you how it is, and this is why.
Alethea, over to you.
Okay. Hi, Jonathan. Thank you so much
Hi.
for an amazing talk. It was really great to see. I know. Sorry, I don't know how much about you.
I heard it was really great. Yeah.
Nothing. Okay, it was really great to see. Then I hit mute. I was trying to unraise my hand. I think a couple of students from my materials class were attending the lecture, and actually this morning we had a talk incorporating Bourdieu's fields of production, and talks about the Bauhaus movement, and actually making references to IKEA, and then also they're doing a reading on Victor Papanek for 2 weeks from now. So it was really fascinating to see you pull this through also in your lecture, and so many fascinating ideas. I have this question in general about how we kind of critique and analyze the existing frameworks of practice and understanding them, and the existing frameworks of market versus like what are some other potentials that are not currently in that realm of how we understand it, right? So even building science as a sort of discipline emerged as a post-analytical process. And so the mode by which we kind of consider building science is one where we kind of analyze and understand our existing building industry, our existing building systems, and reascribe ways to approach that towards better environmental or social outcomes. However, I'm curious, and you kind of like hinted at this a little bit, like you at times you may need to have the certain position or abilities to kind of engage in other realms that we're not currently capturing in practice or in the discipline. But I wonder, you know, to what extent would you identify architectural science as different from building science, and how? And then second, in terms of practice formation, which you touched upon in one of your slides, and in how in larger practices, there may be these kinds of different elements or roles that trained architects end up falling into, that there might be actually entirely different modalities of forming practice, whereby we create more of these networks and we can begin to actually engage with you know, specialists in biology and in environmental you know, analyses and soil science, you know, beyond just our traditional engineers or traditional you know, connections with developers. And I think a part of that too is that, you know, going back to the origins of the building units and the sort of DNA of what we are constructing with, how do we begin to look at the financing of that aspect? Because there's all of these layers of real costs to the building materials and the systems that we're not even accounting for. So that whole conversation about the developer's pro forma, you know, even that does not account for all of these other layers of real costs and embedded costs before the building's even constructed, including after. So I'm wondering, I know that was a lot, but like, I know you have lots of ideas about this, so.
Yeah, I think I think it's important to answer your first question to distinguish between building science and architectural science. And I think that the way that you put it is exactly right. That building science in many ways is a reactive field. And if you look at both sort of sources of knowledge and the people who have knowledge in that field, you know, many of them coming out of like forensic inspection firms. Let's find out why this motel rotted out from the inside, which is a question that's worth answering. That the question about architectural science, I think that that's something that we really need to defend, and we need to develop within the institution, because that's what we can do that no one else can, right? We have the freedom and the flexibility and the ability to make connections without being driven exclusively by a profit motive. And I think we need to be really careful that we're not pushed into, and that we're aware of you know, institutional arrangements that might erode that ability and freedom that we have. I think that's really, really critical. So we need to sort of own that role more. I think that this also goes back to my broader sort of thinking about specialization, about diversity. Dan Hoffman, I think, has branded me a pragmatist on multiple fronts. But I don't think it needs to be, we're as a profession, we're really, we tend to see things as either or, right? Like, we're going to go in this new direction and leave everything we've been doing behind. And so I think we need to find some intellectual frameworks and also forms of education and orienting ourselves towards projects that let us acknowledge that, like, we can make a small but significant improvement on those developer projects where the pro forma is king. And at the same time, we can move forward on these really broad imaginative projects that I think a lot more promise in the future. So at the end of the presentation, we're working with the regenerative framework. I think that that's one sort of interesting sort of philosophical way of thinking about things, because it really forces you to look at what you would otherwise hold as opposing beliefs or opposing forces, and try to find a path of where you can unite those two things. So I think we need to do sort of more of that in general. So that's where I was talking about the fragmentation within architecture really being a problem.
I think that might conclude this evening. So thank you again, Jonathan, for an amazing talk. And thank you everybody for coming out for the lecture. And you will find in the chat the Zoom address for the foyer, where we can gather casually in an unrecorded space after a 5-minute pause. So you're all invited if you so choose. If not, have a wonderful weekend. And yeah, thanks again for coming.
Thank you.